Hi, everybody. Virginia Summy here, and thanks for joining us for another one-on-one interview with the Civil War documentary. Today, we are joined by Paul Ringel. He is a professor of history at High Point University in High Point, North Carolina, and his book, Commercializing Childhood, came out in 2015 by the University of Massachusetts Press, and it focuses on children's magazines in the 19th century. And as youth grew as a consumer demographic, these magazines were essentially teaching children how to be consumers. So I'm going to ask Paul to tell you a little bit more about these magazines and about the book. And then we're going to talk about how the Civil War changed this idea of these children as consumers and these magazines. So Paul, thank you for joining us. And if you could tell us a little bit more about these children's magazines.
Sure. So the children's magazines really start in this country in the 1820s, which really kind of times right along with those demographic shifts you were talking about. As people start moving into cities in really large numbers, that's when we start to see the kind of consumer base that becomes big enough for these magazines to start to exist and survive. And at first they're really small. I mean, most of the early ones have circulations of 4,000 or 5,000 customers, and a lot of them are evangelical. And we're going to talk about the war in a couple minutes, but the war in some ways really kickstarts the magazines. The industry really starts to explode in the 1870s. And the two major magazines that we get kind of leading the field are the Youth's Companion, which starts back in the 1827, but it's very small until as late as the 1860. It's only about 4,000 or 5,000 circulation. But by the time we get to the 1880s, this is one of the largest circulating magazines of any kind in the United States. By the 1890s, it peaks with about 500,000 subscribers a week, which makes it the largest selling magazine of any kind at that period. The other one is St. Nicholas, which starts in 1873, and it comes out of Scribner's Publishing House, which is a really kind of elite New England publishing house, actually, sorry, New York publishing house. And it's never as big as the Youth's Companion. It kind of tops out at about a 75 or 80,000 circulation and sort of sustains that really into the Depression, but it becomes the magazine of elites. It becomes the magazine of highly educated, wealthy families, and it brings in writers like Louisa May Alcott and Mark Twain and all sorts of really prominent writers, because during the late 1800s, you don't have this really strong divide between adult literature and children's literature. You have writers like Twain and Alcott and Edith Wharton and Jack London, who are all writing for children as well as for adults. And so these two magazines really become sites that sort of shape the way that children become trained to become consumers. And I should say really clearly here, we're talking about white children, and we're talking about middle class and wealthy children. There's very little attention paid to working class children. The Youth's Companion starts to do that in the late 1800s, and into the 20th century, they give a little more attention to that. But almost nobody pays any attention to Black writers or Black readers in this industry until 1920.
Yeah. And this is also largely these are northern-based publications as well, yeah, aren't they? Or were there, did they have kind of southern-based publications on a smaller scale? Or?
So there are some southern books that come out for children, especially readers, and trying to train, educate. It's a little bit of the Daughters of the Confederacy stuff, maybe a generation earlier. But as far as I can tell, there are no magazines for children coming out of the South. They just don't have the customer base for it, and they don't have the infrastructure for it. Almost all of the magazines that we see in the 19th century, at least the ones that survive for more than a couple issues, they almost all come out of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a couple of anecdotes that I particularly want to talk
Okay.
about, but on a general level, how does the Civil War change the consumer habits of youth, and particularly how they were marketed to as reflected in these magazines?
Yeah, so there's really two answers that depends a little bit on the divide between the Youth Companion on the one hand, and St. Nicholas doesn't exist yet, but
Mhm.
there's other magazines like Our Young Folks and some other magazines that's ultimately become funneled literally into St. Nicholas in 1873. They purchased some of these older magazines and just kind of merged them. So there's two traditions. One is the kind of evangelical conservative tradition of the Youth Companion. And when the war starts, the Youth Companion has been kind of edging towards providing more exciting material for the kids, more, I call it genteel sensationalism in the book. So they try to come up with stories that will excite kids, but also give them proper moral guidance. So my favorite one comes out in, I think, 1857, when this new editor named Daniel Sharp Ford takes over the Companion. His very first issue in January of 1857, he leads with a picture of a giant wicker man in the Fiji Islands, and they're pushing all these people in to be human sacrificed in the wicker man, and it's this like horrifying picture. But basically, yes, you're laughing. He's using this story to talk about this is what happens when people don't have proper training as Christians. And so they're using all this exciting, sensational, horrifying content to get the kids excited and want to read the paper. But then they use it for their moral ends. So that's what has been happening in the late 1850s in the Companion. And as soon as the war starts, it stops. So they stop using any of this sensationalist stuff. And there's nothing about the war until the end of 1861. They spend so the war starts in April. I think it's December of 1861 before they have anything at all about the war. It just doesn't exist in the Companion. And then the first piece is that William Walker's war story, which I think is one that you wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, definitely. So you start off the Civil War chapter with the story of William Walker. And yeah, it doesn't come out until towards the end of 1861. But what struck me was how different the tone was and different the messaging was for particularly children of the United States of the Union versus, as me as a scholar of the South, children of the Confederacy. Because children of the Confederacy were, very much taught this kind of Confederate nationalism, manhood, proper gender roles. And this kind of takes a different angle, if you
Yeah.
could explain that.
Yeah, well, first of all, we should say that this is not what all of the Northern magazines are doing in 1861. The kind of more liberal, progressive magazines are very much promoting Union nationalism. And there's a wave of stories about drummer boys and about the little boys who go off and sacrifice themselves for the Union. And there's this surge of sales of Union Army replica uniforms and hats, and so a lot of the Northerners, especially the progressive kind of New England elites who are leading the charge to fight this war, they are very much doing this kind of rah-rah patriotism. The Companion doesn't do that, and even when they do, at least not right away, and when they do send this boy off to war, it's really all about kind of the moral decision, because his father is gone. I can't remember if the father is dead or off at war, but he's living at home with his mother and his two sisters. And there's this kind of moral debate that's at the center of the story about whether this promising young man who can go off to college and make something of himself, whether he should continue on this path in order to become the provider for his mother and sisters, or whether he should go off and serve in the Union. And ultimately, his mother doesn't really want him to, and his sisters don't really want him to, but he decides that the right thing to do is go off and serve, and he gets killed in his first battle before he even raises his gun. He just gets shot observing and killed. So there's this whole, it's not a rah-rah patriotic story. It's very much about what are the right things to do. And in the end, the story concludes and the mother comes around to this idea that yes, he made the proper moral decision to go and fight for this cause, even if it meant sacrificing his own life and sacrificing the ability to take care of his mother and sisters.
Yeah, I just found that really interesting in the because the Confederates, you don't hear a whole lot about this moral ambiguity
Yeah.
of the war, and so I found the fact that they were kind of emphasizing to these kids that this is a morally ambiguous situation, to be really fascinating, and also kind of harkens back to the role of theology
Yeah.
in all of this. If you could explain some of because these are pretty religious based, like Protestant based magazines, correct?
So they're all Protestant, but there's definitely two different veins of Protestantism. One is evangelical Orthodox Protestantism, very much coming out of Calvinism and not Calvinist anymore, but coming out of that tradition, a belief in the moral stain that gets handed down from generation to generation and original sin and everything like that. That's the vein that the companion comes out of. The other vein is a much more kind of liberal, progressive orthodoxy, kind of Unitarian, coming out of New England in the 1820s and 1830s. And so they're both Protestant, but the different messages are quite distinct within those two kind of separate veins in the industry.
Yeah, I found that to be just really interesting, and also going back to my other anecdote that I really liked, that kind of exemplified this messaging, is that the Confederate begs the Northerner for water, the Union soldier refuses until a wounded drummer boy crawls into his lap to die and begins to recite the Lord's Prayer. This innocent action revives the soldier's compassion and motivates him to offer the enemy his canteen. Both men recover from their wounds, and the Confederate, inspired by this act of Christian charity, swears allegiance to the Union in order to fight side by side with his restored friend.
Yeah.
And just that there is a while there is some moral ambiguity in the war itself, they're teaching very moralistic lessons.
Yes, and they're very patriotic. They're very supportive of the Union cause. There's no ambiguity about whether the Union cause is the right cause. I mean, there's no Copperhead kind of element to this magazine at all. Daniel Sharp Ford, the editor, is very pro-Union. He's just not sure that the kids should be involved. And really, for about the first half of the war, there is this reluctance on the part of the companion, even as everybody else is promoting drummer boys and patriotism and everything. They're very much like, support the Union, but do it at home. Your place is at home. Raise money for the Union, knit socks for the soldiers, do things, take care of your mother while your father's away, do good stuff to serve the Union cause at home. But this is not, there's one story, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it ends with, this is not your fight, you're too young for this. And so the first half of the war, they really focus on, yes, we should support the Union, but no, these boys should not be going and running out to the battlefront.
So tell us about, and this kind of part of, I guess, is kind of a sub part of this, the dime novels.
Yeah.
That starts coming out along with this. Can you tell us about the dime novels?
Yes, so I argue that this is one of the things that shifts the companion in a different direction during the second half of the war. Dime novels, and there's been kind of sensationalist literature like this before the Civil War, but dime novels, and the actual term dime novels, comes out of this company called Beadle and Adams, which starts in 1861, and they start doing these kind of romantic, and not just romance in terms of like what we think of as romance novel, but like old school romanticism, like what's his name, Last of the Mohicans kind of romance, that kind of. So, and there's very much a kind of Last of the Mohicans kind of James Fenimore Cooper element to a lot of this. There are these stories that aren't originally created for children. They're not, the audience isn't meant to be children. Beadle and Adams, and mostly Erastus Beadle, Adams is more of a kind of a financial silent partner, but Erastus Beadle kind of figures out that as these hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers are going to the battlefront, going to the front lines, they're going to want entertainment. And so he puts out these cheap dime novels that they can put in their uniforms and carry along with them really easily. And they're stories of, you know, the frontier, and their stories of pirates and romance and all of this stuff. And what happens is they get really, really popular with the soldiers. Beadle's a marketing genius. He starts shipping just thousands and thousands of free copies to give away to the soldiers, hoping that they'll, you know, get the first couple and then start buying them afterwards. And they become this big sensation. And what happens is that as the soldiers start reading them and start getting excited about them, the little boys want to do anything that the soldiers are doing. And so the boys see that the soldiers are reading these stories, and the stories start to take hold with the boys as well. And it becomes a little bit of a controversy in the 1860s, not so much then. They're going to become much more controversial in the 1870s under people like Anthony Comstock, who see them as immoral and horrifying, and, you know, very much of an idea that, you know, this is the damage that books can do. It doesn't quite hit that level during the war, because people have too many other things to think about, I think. But there is a kind of a wave by 1863 of fears about juvenile delinquency among Northern boys, because their fathers are gone and their mothers are working and they're not getting the normal kind of supervision. And there's a little bit of a fear that these dime novels are feeding into this. And in magazines like The Atlantic, they start actually talking about these novels, and they say, yeah, they're not the best. You know, the quality of literature isn't very high, but we don't really think you should be worried about them like morally injuring your children. So there's not a lot of momentum to that. It comes in 1873 is when it really starts to rocket, but not so much in the war. And so when Daniel Sharp Ford and the Companion starts talking about, or starts seeing that these dime novels are getting so popular and that a lot of his audience is reading these dime novels, he starts thinking, well, I have to start competing with that, or I'm going to lose the audience I've been developing. And so he starts thinking about how he can do that in the moral way that he wants to. And one of the things we start to see in 1863, he starts making these stories that the kids start getting more involved, or sometimes even not just the kids, but the soldiers. He starts telling more and more stories about soldiers and the good things that the Union soldiers are doing. And even, especially in 1864 and 1865, he starts talking about the moral corruption of the South through racism, and how the Black freed people are working with the Union soldiers to end this war and make things better for everybody. So this is like the one moment in 19th century American children's magazines where you see these white editors having anything good to say about Black people, because they really see the South. By 1864, the South is like the devil. The South is, you know, everything that's wrong, and everything that's morally corrupt. And so if the freed people are working with the Union soldiers to defeat the South, this is the one moment, and it only lasts from about 1863 to about 1866, that you see this sort of celebration of the bravery of freed people who are rescuing Union soldiers in comparison to the cowardice of the Confederate soldiers, who give up any time, you know, there's any kind of little obstacle, they just surrender. And, you know, because they're all really being manipulated by their overlords, the slaveholders, right? We get back to the slave power what I tell my students, we have to think about the slave power, capital S, capital P.
Yeah.
And so we get a lot of that in 1864, 1865.
That actually goes perfectly into my next question was, as these publications, kind of focused on moral issues, did they address slavery at all? Which was, what the whole shebang was, the root of the whole shebang. But you're saying not really until about 1863, until
So the companion doesn't address it almost at all. And the reason why, there's a really interesting backstory to this. There's a magazine, one of the first generation, comes out in, I think, 1831, early 1830s, called the Juvenile Miscellany. And it comes out in Boston, and the editor of the Miscellany is Lydia Maria Child, who was an early female author and an early supporter of William Lloyd Garrison and joiner of the abolitionist cause, and an activist for Native American rights and women's rights. And she really, at the beginning of the magazine in the early 1830s, she doesn't start by dealing with slavery, but she really pushes what girls can do in a way that the other magazines don't. And she pushes for Native American rights. A lot of the stories are about white kids and Native American kids working together. A couple of years later, she kind of has this conversion experience through Garrison, and she starts writing these stories talking about the horrors of slavery, and specifically about the horrors of Black children being separated from their parents. And as soon as she starts publishing these stories, the white subscribers start canceling their subscriptions. And within 6 months, the magazine is basically dead. And so what the industry learns from the miscellany is, don't talk about this stuff, just avoid it like the plague. And so the companion doesn't really talk about slavery until late 1863, early 1864. And then for about a year or so, it really dives into not so much focusing on the horrors of slavery, although there's a little bit of that, but more focusing on the corruption of Southerners and the possible good that Black freed people can do once they're freed from their Southern overlords. So that happens for just a couple of years. And then there's another magazine that I talked about a minute ago called Our Young Folks that starts, I think, in 1865 and is very much of that New England kind of radical Republican mentality that is very, very pro freedmen's rights and very focused on providing equal rights for emancipated people after the war. But that focus really only continues in 65, 67, and eventually it gets bought out by St. Nicholas, which really goes back to pretty much avoiding Black people almost altogether.
So as we were talking before we started to record, some of you have a chapter coming out early next year about Brownie's book, which didn't come out until 1920, right. But as these magazines that are mainly the topic of this largely avoided, particularly race, this was by Du Bois and for Black children.
Yeah, so it comes out of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis. And for much of the 19 teens, Du Bois is publishing one issue a year in The Crisis called The Children's Issue. And he's addressing all the issues that he wants Black children to be aware of and raising awareness of Black history and Black accomplishment and trying to raise the talented 10th, right? But what starts to happen during World War I is as we start to see the Great Migration and the backlash in 1919, there's a lot of violence that starts to happen against Black communities. There's a wave of riots and white riots against Black communities in Chicago in 1919, in East St. Louis in 1917, in Tulsa in 1921. Those are just a few of the many riots. And what Du Bois decides around 1919 or so is he has to separate his publication for kids from the publication for adults because he doesn't want the kids reading about the lynchings, about the violence, about the murders. And so he comes out with another magazine specifically for kids called the Brownies Book. And he's the nominal editor. The day-to-day operations are run by Jessie Fawcett, who becomes a really prominent female author in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. And so they run this magazine, and it only lasts for about 2 years, well, exactly 2 years, January 1920 to December 1921. And this piece that I have coming out next year, I argue that, there's a lot of reasons why this magazine didn't work. Black audiences were smaller, they were poorer, they had a hard time sustaining their own magazine. But one of the big reasons is that white audiences had been trained all the way back from the 1820s and certainly from the Civil War on to be consumers and to understand the value of a children's magazine for them and their families. And none of that existed for Black children. There were no opportunities, as far as I know, for Black authors or Black editors. And so you get this incredible magazine, Jessie Fawcett's publishing in there. Langston Hughes has a number of pieces in the Brownies Book. Arna Bontemps. There's a lot of really prominent writers, both fiction, nonfiction, poetry. But when white kids are getting the Hardy Boys and books like that in the 20s and all these kind of sensational books that are super exciting and the kids are off on their own solving adventures and the Bobbsey twins and things like that, this magazine is really targeted, almost reads like St. Nicholas in the 1870s, right? It's like half a century behind because you have to train these Black families in a way that nobody's ever done before. And so it's kind of miraculous that it happens at all, but it's really kind of commercially out of step with what's happening in the industry. So it's hard for them to get any grip. And Du Bois says in 1921, in one of his many appeals to try to get more subscribers for this magazine, he says our break-even point is 12,000 subscribers. Now remember, at this point, St. Nicholas has like 75 or 80,000, and the Youth's Companion is declining at this point. In fact, both magazines are declining, but still it has over 100,000. He's trying to get 12. And in December of 1921, he says, we haven't even been able to get 5. And so he's not even close. And so they have to shutter the magazine after only 24 episodes because it just can't sustain itself.
Imagine a publication that has stuff by Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
You get 5,000 subscribers. Wow. That has to be so interesting to go back and look at those.
Yeah.
Though. Where are they now? Are they in like Du Bois's archival or
easiest place to get them is if you Google the Library of Congress, they have a digital run of 23 of the 24 episodes. For whatever reason, they don't have the issues. They don't have the last issue, December of 21, but you can go online and read them all. And Du Bois is really teaching these kids. This is part of the new Negro movement of the 20s, that you have to be politically aware. You have to know. He's teaching them, this is what's happening in Tulsa. This is what's happening in Congress with the anti-lynching bills. This is what's happening with the League of Nations and the fight that Woodrow Wilson has, and the presidential election of 1920. And so he's really kind of training them to become citizens. And there's been some really, really great scholarly writing about the Brownies Book from the perspective of fitting it in with the new Negro ideologies and fitting it in with, here's what they're writing in terms of the legacy of Black children's literature. But what I was trying to do, because I don't think anybody's done this before, is fitting the Brownies Book in with the kind of the larger context of the industry as a whole. And showing why even now, we need diverse books, right? And we don't have enough Black and female and all sorts of different writers other than white male writers. And that sort of systemic divide goes back to the Brownies book and earlier, and that's really what I wanted to show in this article.
Nice. Well, my last question is, what would you say is kind of the legacy of these children's magazines? I mean, I remember, now, remember I had the highlights when I was little,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah,
like
we don't really
find the
have.
picture. Is there any sort of, legacy of these that are how we talk to children about events or consumerism, anything like that?
Yeah, I think there is. It's not in magazines because those magazines don't really exist. Yeah, everybody our age says highlights, right?
Yeah.
There's a magazine called Cricket that came out, I want to say in like the 80s or 90s. Too late for me. But it was intentionally meant to be the kind of the successor to St. Nicholas. And it lasted for a while, but it never really got the kind of the impact of St. Nicholas. And then there was a magazine that came out, I think in the 70s called Ebony Jr. that was meant to be the kind of the successor to the Brownies book. And that lasted for a while. And somebody's written a book on Ebony Jr. too. I don't know too much about it. But I would say that all of these debates that we're having now about what kids should be reading and what is in their history books, but also in their novels, and especially in like YA, right? What should kids be reading in graphic novels, in YA literature? I would say that that's a legacy of the children's magazines, because the children's magazines took this question from whether kids should be treated as consumers to what kinds of consumers should they be. There's no longer any doubt by the time St. Nicholas and Youth's Companion reached their peak in the early 20th century, there's no longer any doubt that children are going to be consumers. But what are we going to give them? And I think that what we're talking about now is very much a legacy of the Youth's Companion and St. Nicholas. And in fact, I'm working on a new book that's looking at, starting with the magazines and the books of that time period, how over each generation we've tried to teach kids history through entertainment. So starting with magazines, then going to toys like Lincoln Logs and teddy bears, and then going to children's movies in the 30s and Disneyland and Davy Crockett in the 50s, to Schoolhouse Rock in the 70s, to the Oregon Trail and Red Dead, Red Dead Assassin or whatever it is. But there's all these historical video games now, and so I'm doing a new book on how we teach kids history through entertainment, and I think that's the legacy, because it's really Nicholas and the Youth's Companion that are the first ones to do that.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and for sharing all of this with our Civil War patrons. So if you are interested, then go Google Commercializing Childhood, go order it. It is available on Amazon. It's available through the press. Go out and buy it. It is really is a very fascinating book. Paul, thank you so much again for joining us. And we look forward and tune in next time for our next one-on-one author interview.